Well, our next guest joins us with the catalyst he thinks will be the most important for investors next week. Let's bring in Adam Crisafulli from Vital Knowledge. Adam, it's great to have you back on, and let's start right there. What do you think moves the market?
I think for next week, the most important catalyst will be tech earnings. Micron, most critically Tuesday night, and then also Jabil and Accenture are also going to be, I think, important. The Fed and economic data gets a lot of attention, but really this market has been all about this amazing, breathtaking melt-up move that we've seen in tech, driven in large part by AI. So next week, we're going to two companies that are very levered to AI that benefit a lot from the enthusiasm and momentum, Micron and Jabil, and then a company that is thought to be potentially at existential risk from AI adoption, which is Accenture. So you're going to get kind of an interesting perspective from both ends of the spectrum.
Yeah, and I realize you just said that maybe it's not as meaningful to this market here, but we do get a flurry of Fed speakers next week too, and we do get that inflation reading. Is that really already baked in here, or could that have the potential to move markets as well?
I think it could definitely be interesting. There definitely is not unanimity on the Fed right now. You can see that from the distribution of the dots on the Wednesday supplemental. So, to the extent we hear a lot of the individuals explain how they are thinking on the outlook, that could be interesting. The PCE also obviously is the Fed's preferred inflation reading. So that's going to be critical as well. I just think for the most part, we have a decent sense of how the data for the month of August shaped up. And so now the focus I think is more on the September readings, which we'll get in a couple of weeks. But definitely the Fed obviously is front and center. So any speaker will be important to listen to.
Adam, you see these trade headlines having a significant impact so far?
The market seems to have moved on from trade. I think companies have a decent amount of clarity as to kind of how tariff policy is shaping up, and they're adjusting accordingly. I think very interesting will be later in the year when we start to get the Supreme Court oral hearings in the IEEPA tariff case. That's going to be in early November, so that's going to be really important. And there doesn't necessarily seem to be a consensus as to whether or not eliminating the IEEPA tariffs is good or bad. I think you can make an argument that striking them down at this point in time could be negative for the market. You could place upward pressure on yield given how much revenue they're generating. And also it's just going to create months of uncertainty if those were to go away. And the White House has to find new justifications to keep in place the tariffs, which they've said they're going to do. So I think for now, companies are kind of looking more at that IEEPA case in the Supreme Court. That's kind of the next real big tariff catalyst.
And Adam, Oracle has had this amazing move over the last several sessions. I mean, really, it was just one session. It was a major move, but it's held up. And here in overtime, it's higher by about 1% still. And again, it was up 4%, I believe, today. A lot of people might have doubted it can maintain anything near those levels after it reported its guidance. What do you make of the broader message in this move from a company that's been around for a long time?
You continue to see every day flurries of headlines talking about the unbelievable momentum that's occurring in AI. So today alone in the morning, there was an article on The Information about OpenAI spending about $450 billion over the next 5 years on compute. Remember, that was the huge part of the RPO boost at Oracle. A lot of that was driven by OpenAI. So that's another positive, suggesting that the biggest, most prominent player in the industry continues to spend a lot of money. XAI, there was a lot of articles about them raising money at a $200 billion valuation. And then right before the close, there was a report on Bloomberg about how Oracle could be striking a deal with Meta for a $20 billion AI compute contract. So the headline and news flow around AI just remains extremely bullish. And Oracle really has risen to the top to become one of the most prominent names in the industry. And that continues to drive the shares higher.
Adam, I'm going to ask you the same question I asked Rebecca Patterson earlier in the hour, and that is, how are you gauging geopolitical risk, given some of the activities we're seeing play out across the world right now, even as we do see stocks at record highs, and given the fact that we are going into sort of the big, hefty week of UN General Assembly, too?
Yeah, it's definitely kind of fallen down the list, I think, of things that markets are focused on right now, and perhaps that creates a risk in that there isn't a lot of focus. What's happening in the Middle East doesn't really seem to be impacting the narrative. There doesn't seem to be enormous risk around oil supply, which usually is a transmission mechanism where Middle Eastern events will impact equity sentiment. And there doesn't necessarily seem to be a lot of kind of focus for U.S. stocks about what's happening in Ukraine right now. There has been rumblings in Washington and Brussels about imposing incremental sanctions on Russia and potentially buyers of Russian energy, but it doesn't seem like there's a ton of momentum for imminent action on that front. So I would say that that's going to kind of stay in the periphery for now.